NASA says now is the ideal time to focus on the planet Venus. This follows the new revelation of conceivable life in the world. If you somehow happen to take a look at NASA's records from the 1960s, you'd see the space organization calling Venus a planet from damnation. Simultaneously, Mars turned into our predestination. Such cautious naming of the deepest planets isn't a happenstance. During the tempestuous space race, the Soviet Association was focused on sending exorbitant missions to Venus. The ghastly planet showed next to zero possibilities for life, yet the Soviet space program didn't decommission the Venera program until the fall of the domain. Because of Neil deGrasse Tyson, we at long last realized the reason why. Join us as we dissect the declassified photographs from Venus taken by the Soviet Association. The fall of the Soviet Association was dynamic in more ways than one. Not only did it shift the international direction of the world, but the deficiency of the realm also sank numerous mysteries. It's not obscure that the Soviets had a deep affinity for mysteries. From running the most high-level intelligence organization in the world to being secretive about their potential outsider contact, the former superpower carries various secrets within itself. In all honesty, before the US of America dominated most of the planetary endeavors in outer space, the Soviet Association was leading the game. While the realm has a long history of successful and fruitless space missions, its greatest obsession was on the inward, terrible planet Venus. In the Russian language, you'd perceive Venus as Venera, and consequently, the resulting name of the mission that spanned from 1961 to 1983. During the same time, the United States of America was in the middle of sending its missions to the moon. So, in a calculated way, the Soviets chose to utilize their assets elsewhere. We can't say that the whole fixation on the second planet from our sun is odd. Did the Soviets anticipate utilizing the planet's surface as a practical and phenomenal military installation? Or were they conceivably hoping to colonize the planet later, looking for any forms of life up there? It's very hard to say why the domain was fixated on the shocking planet. Since the Soviets authorized these exploration journeys during the Cold War, they weren't precisely open with their points and targets. In fact, all that we know about the Venusian missions is based on unarchived and declassified proof. And even then, it's difficult to pinpoint what the Soviets were looking for and if they abandoned the mysterious missions. While the realm didn't land on Venus even twice or thrice, that's just rudimentary. The Soviets launched 28 expensive rockets to the horrendous planet, and 13 of those entered the Venusian atmosphere, while 8 landed effectively. Such refined missions had placed the realm in a leading position in space exploration drives. Sure, the US of America was a close second, but NASA was more interested in satellites and mechanical arrangements than exploring life on planets. Its love for Mars came afterward. So, your history textbook might not tell you this, but the Soviet space program was the first organization to send a probe into the atmosphere of a planet other than Earth. It also has another bundle of firsts on its resume. The USSR became the first state to achieve a soft landing on another planet. It was also the first to return pictures and sounds from the surface of a different planet. That's right, the Soviets had their own moment of one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That was decades before the US. So why do we seldom get to hear about such milestone missions? Remember what we said about the Soviet proclivity for staying discreet? Well, that is just one of the many reasons behind the restriction of the Soviet space program. Back in 1992, the famous organization was decommissioned in the fallout of the USSR. As the organization had to be restored with its new Russian identity, the Rose Universe, a lot of its recorded information was either lost or destroyed. This is precisely why we don't have a clear answer for why the Soviets launched 28 spacecraft into the Venusian air. However, if we had to make the most reasonable guess, maybe the Soviet decision to explore Venus was about cost efficiency more than anything else. It is not necessarily the case that the space program wasn't hopeful about the habitability of the planet. They were searching for reasonable water presence, levels of solar radiation, and the general demeanor of the planet. Without a series of these space missions, it would have been close to impossible to assess Venus' high temperatures and thick atmosphere. Of course, today, many astronomers don't believe that the appalling planet could support life. The temperatures up there are high enough to melt lead, and water is scarce. Additionally, due to its thick atmosphere, The atmospheric pressure on Venus is 90 times that of our planet Earth. However, these are very recent and modern developments. To dismiss the USSR's contribution to the investigation of Venus is akin to whitewashing history. As far as the Soviets were concerned, Venus was worth investigating, even if it was just to advance the space race. Exploring more habitable planets like Mars wasn't exactly off the table, but it was more expensive than investigating Venus. All that simply reduces to the distance from Earth to any other astronomical body. On average, the dreadful planet is only 40 million kilometers away from our home, while Mars is on average 250 million kilometers away. Such immense differences in distance translate to significant differences in costs. Also, if the United States of America wasn't the world's largest economy, it could never have been easy to explore Mars. Different bits of hearsay on the block also suggest that the Soviet missions were unreliable and had massive technical gaps. Clearly, the spacecraft weren't suited for covering interstellar distances. Additionally, the organization had a terrible track record of losing contact with its rockets. So it seems logical why the Soviet space program was choosing a shorter and closer journey that would actually yield results. But if we don't raise the space race in this context, the story of the Venera missions would be incomplete. The United States of America wasn't even on the space map when the Soviet program launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957. This particular move had intensified the space rivalry. However, what's truly fascinating is why the US had focused itself on the Moon in the first place. Strange domain to the side, NASA had a series of failures with its Venus missions during the 1960s. The US Space Agency found itself in a gridlock known as the Venus Curse. Each time they launched a probe into the Venusian air, it went terribly wrong. This is precisely when the Soviet Association saw a valuable opportunity to capitalize on NASA's failures. At that time, both the US and USSR were hell-bent on winning the space race. The most intelligent strategy was to diverge into different options. It was a quiet understanding. Very decisively, the Soviet space program seized the Earth's sister planet for the agency. The greatest milestone in the space tussle was to accomplish something that its competitive partner had failed to do. Despite the realm's limited resources and flawed governance, it repeatedly launched missions to Venus to secure its triumphant position against the US. Meanwhile, NASA focused on the Moon's mission. Obviously, this strategic choice wasn't without antagonism and propaganda. To obscure their major failures with Venus, the American agency was motivated to malign the USSR's obsession with the planet. In popular media, Venus was portrayed as the dreadful planet, while Mars became man's destiny. These connotations didn't matter to the Soviets. Their mission was to demonstrate superiority over the Americans, and they weren't unsuccessful in doing so. The Venera missions are nearly forgotten in present history, but despite their outdated technology, those missions were highly modern, advanced, and ambitious. In fact, if we need to pick an event that marked the dawn of the space age, the Venera investigations would lead. Harking back to the 1950s, the Soviets began to experiment with the design and development details of the probes. Furthermore, for the next 30 years, they kept building and launching interplanetary spacecraft as part of the Venera program. Since the program was running parallel to a highly volatile Cold War, the Soviets were focused on enhancing their resources. Fortunately for them, the early years of the conflict provided them with more actual work capacity than the United States of America. That benefit proved to be quite profitable. The USSR started to build and launch larger rockets that were designed to maintain high altitudes and cover vast distances. The Soviets were quick to experiment with both manned and unmanned spacecraft. Simultaneously, the Soviet academic community was working on a series of calculations and assessments to make accurate trajectories for the Venus missions. In the background, their Mars programs were also running successfully. For the Soviet Space Agency, nothing was more important than developing complex instrumentation for these probes. This led to the greatest revelations in the history of astronomical investigations. In 1966, the Soviet agency launched Venera 3, making it the first artificial probe to enter the atmosphere of Venus and successfully touch the planet's surface. This groundbreaking achievement intensified the competition between the two superpowers. Instead of the American missions that were fraught with failures and stops, the Soviet program continued to gain momentum. Despite the program's gradual pace, the USSR was making all the right moves to send successful probes into the Venusian atmosphere. The most concerning issue with this endeavor was limited design capability. The Soviets rushed to overcome their design issues and launched the largest rocket of the Venera program in the 1970s. Their high lifting capacity allowed them to conduct the first dual launches of Venera 4 and Venera 5. According to most historians, this was the most interesting decade in the history of astronomical investigations. In fact, the US of America and the USSR had created a trend of launching competing probes to Venus. The Soviets were already leading the race, but NASA wasn't one to surrender. The US agency launched Mariner 5 around the same time, creating a fierce competition between the two entities. Most astronomers believe that this specific event fueled the space race to its peak, making both entities very competitive and assertive in their approach. Despite Mariner 5's great success, the Soviet Space Agency once again made history with its Venera program. In 1975, the Soviets launched the largest spacecraft in their history, a 5-ton heavyweight probe. Venera 9 marked a series of firsts for the agency. It was the first time any spacecraft could successfully capture and beam back high-resolution black and white images of the Venusian surface. The photo series had a bundle of firsts for the world as well. These were the first snap maps that humanity had taken on a planet other than our own. And just so you know, this was all happening nearly 20 years before NASA's Mars obsession. The advanced visual instrumentation on Venera 9 gave the world some of the first looks at Venus' harsh and rugged landscape. These photos enhanced the global scientific community's understanding of the Venusian environment. Interestingly, the Soviet fixation on the planet didn't fade away with this milestone achievement. Just 1 year later, the USSR Space Agency launched the subsequent probe, Venera 10. It became the first spacecraft to use color imaging technology. So if you ever get to see pictures of Venus, the brightly colored ones were taken by Venera 10. The Soviet space program continued its obsession for another 7 years, launching a series of Venera spacecraft. Each launch was designed to be more refined, advanced, and detailed than the previous one. However, it wasn't until Venera 13 that the Soviet agency achieved its greatest milestone. In 1981, the USSR launched its final probe to the dreadful planet. Not only did Venera 13 capture highly advanced color images of Venus, but it also became the first spacecraft to transmit recorded sounds of the Venusian atmosphere. This specific mission had transformed the direction of astronomical studies forever. Despite the sudden halt of the Soviet Association in the early 90s, its contribution to planetary exploration ensured a lasting legacy for humanity. You see, a lot of what we know today about the planet Venus comes from the Soviet probe series. As the realm sank with its secrets, it also ensured that its astronomical achievements would be declassified sooner or later. Despite such great achievements, it's intriguing why the US and USSR didn't enter the space race together. Both of these superpowers had taken on isolated approaches to planetary exploration. Both the US and USSR had distinct strategic and philosophical reasons for focusing on different celestial bodies. The Soviet Association, emerging from World War II as a superpower alongside the US, sought to demonstrate its scientific and technological prowess to the world. Space exploration became a crucial arena for this competition, known as the space race, which reflected the broader ideological rivalry between socialism and capitalism during the Cold War. For the Soviets, Venus represented a challenging yet feasible objective for exploration. Its proximity to Earth, compared to Mars, made it a practical choice for early space missions, despite the extreme conditions on Venus, such as its searing temperatures and crushing atmospheric pressure. The Soviet space program saw a valuable opportunity to achieve significant scientific milestones by sending multiple probes, like the Venera series. They aimed not only to gather data but also to achieve symbolic victories over their American rivals. In contrast, the US turned its focus predominantly towards the Moon. The lunar missions, culminating in the iconic Apollo 11 landing in 1969, were driven by President Kennedy's ambitious vision to showcase American technological superiority and secure a strategic foothold in space. The Moon missions impressed global audiences and highlighted American ingenuity, overshadowing many Soviet achievements in the public eye. While the U.S. concentrated on high-profile lunar landings, the Soviet Association quietly advanced its Venus exploration efforts. The Venera missions, despite facing technical challenges and occasional setbacks, consistently achieved historic milestones. These included the first successful soft landing on another planet, the first transmission of images from the surface of another planet, and the first examination of another planet's atmosphere. The Venera program continued to push the boundaries of space exploration, utilizing the USSR's expertise in rocketry and spacecraft design. Each mission built upon the lessons learned from previous efforts, refining technology and survival strategies for Venus's harsh conditions. These missions not only expanded humanity's understanding of planetary science, but also laid the groundwork for future explorations of other celestial bodies in the solar system. Moreover, the Soviet Association's approach to Venusian exploration reflected its broader scientific ambitions and commitment to global prestige. Despite economic challenges and political pressures, the USSR maintained a robust space program that significantly contributed to the global body of scientific knowledge. The legacy of the Venera missions endures as a testament to human curiosity and perseverance in the face of daunting challenges. Looking back, both the US and USSR achieved remarkable milestones during the space race, each leaving a lasting impact on space exploration and scientific discovery. The competition spurred rapid advancements in technology and engineering, paving the way for future generations of space explorers. Today, as new missions to Venus are planned and executed by various space agencies, including NASA and ESA, the lessons learned from the Venera missions continue to inform and inspire efforts to unravel the mysteries of our neighboring planets. Thus, while Venus remains a forbidding and inhospitable world, the daring ventures of the Soviet Venera program serve as a reminder of humanity's quest for knowledge and our enduring spirit of exploration in the universe.